So we're going to talk about where AI fits with quantitative neuroimaging. And frankly, in your mind, you can just think of this as a talk on quantitative neuroimaging and the role that it might play in your practices. So we'll do a little bit on intro to AI, but we'll do most on the impact to the diagnosis and surveillance of a certain number of diseases. So at this point, we know what AI is. It's a branch of computer science that allows computers to do things that we associate with human intelligence. It's one of the key technologies to impact healthcare, along with big data analytics, which is really machine learning, at the present time. You can see that healthcare funding of AI continues to increase over time. This is only to 2019. There's no sign of any abating. And you can also see, and this is probably the most important slide, the big OEMs that sell us our equipment are amongst the biggest patent applicants, which really means not that they're coming out with so many AI products, but it means that there are components throughout these devices that are more and more fueled by AI. We know that AI is all around us, following us everywhere, and we also know that it's better than humans at image recognition, and it's better than humans at speech recognition. It was, many years ago. The hottest topic right now, as we've covered earlier in the meeting, are these foundational models. What makes a foundational model unique is that you can train it on a lot of material, text, images, speech, and the like, but then it picks up additional capabilities that were not specifically trained. It learns how to answer questions. A lot of these bots are done by this type of AI and across the board. And you've seen, the stunts that can be done. This tool can now actually pass parts of the radiology examination, the board examination. It's not a big surprise, right? I mean, when do we use these tools? We usually want to get a piece of information from the web. Now, it's not really much smarter than what it reads. I once asked, what's the biggest technology in AI? And it told me deep learning reconstruction. I said, well, what did it come up with that? Well, I just published an article on deep learning reconstruction in which one of my co-authors made that exact statement. So it just reads back what it can see for the most part. Lots of companies out there, and more every day, some starting to fade because there's more and more consolidation in the industry. But for today's talk, we're really going to talk about how the unique ability of deep learning really has enhanced our ability to do segmentation, and segmentation has a really big role in day-to-day clinical practice. We'll talk about the brain. I believe I pulled the spine out of this talk because of time, but it's being used, for measuring prostate volumes, as you heard from Dr. Rofsky, iron, fat, fibrosis in the liver, biliary tree functional, assessment of stenoses, across the board. It's really a big deal. So this is a neuro talk, so we'll focus on neuro applications, and it's really a really low-hanging fruit.
So the oropharynx. So whenever I think that you're talking about anything in head and neck, one of the most important things to understand is the anatomy, because the anatomy is going to help you understand the pathology. And in terms of pathology in the oropharynx, really it's almost mammography-like, cancer and not cancer, and that's really a lot of times the questions that you're trying to answer for your clinician. So we'll start with anatomy. So what exactly defines the oropharynx? So when it comes to your pharynx, it's divided into three subsites: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the hypopharynx. And luckily they were named in a very easy way to remember, in that the nasopharynx is behind the nose, the oropharynx is behind the oral cavity, and the hypopharynx is the region hypo or below the oropharynx, below them all. So that really can help you to define where you are and how to describe where you are to your clinicians. So really, I kind of think of it as kind of like a pharynx parfait. At the bottom, you have the hypopharynx and larynx. Above that, the oropharynx, and at the very top, the nasopharynx, and your brain is just the cherry on top. And I think that this is important because what we really have is these are the passageway for everything from the outside to come in. The air, the food, the water, it all comes through this passageway. So this is really our big opening to the world. So the boundaries of the oropharynx are basically what separates the oropharynx from the nasopharynx and from the hypopharynx. So what separates the oropharynx from the nasopharynx? It's the soft palate, right? That's what keeps food from coming out of your nose, is the raising of the soft palate, and that protects you from having your food or water go up and out through your nose. So that same thing that stops the food and the water from going into the nasopharynx is also the superior boundary of the oropharynx, and that's the soft palate. At the bottom, what keeps everything from the oropharynx from going down into the larynx? And that's your epiglottis, right? That's what keeps you from choking on the food that you ingest. So the inferior margin of the oropharynx is the epiglottis. So the oropharynx hides behind the oral cavity. You know, it's kind of like a kid hides behind its mom. So the oropharynx is literally directly behind the oral cavity. The oral cavity extends all the way from your lips back to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, and then starting at the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, that's the oropharynx. So they literally are right next to each other, completely contiguous, but there is that boundary.
So an MSK radiologist, very interesting. Our Dr. Chung is our MSK radiologist, a faculty member, does TMJ. Interesting that I'm a neuroradiologist. In our practice, we do TMJ imaging. It's kind of an interesting topic because just because this joint is located next to the skull base and the brain, why would it be neuroradiologists that do it? I honestly think that it should be the musculoskeletal because it is literally, it's a joint, but it's a very important joint and a very unique joint. First of all, it's critical because of its functions of mastication, how we get our nutrition, swallowing, speech, and expression. So if you have TMJ disorder, it's pretty impactful on the quality of life. This joint has a meniscus, just like a knee. And basically, the knee has two menisci, the TMJ has one. So it literally is a joint, and I would rather have Christine read my TMJ than me. But I'm very involved with it. In fact, my senior colleague worked with Clyde Wilkes, who was a internationally known surgeon who did a classification, which we'll go through, of TMJ disorders. But we can see when this joint gets disorders, we get malocclusion, and it really leads to a very high impact quality of life detriment for patients who have TMJ disorders, which are pretty common. This gliding hinged joint has two compartments, a superior and inferior compartment, separated by that meniscus or so-called disc. And the articulation between the maxillofacial structures and the mandible has two components. We got two joints here, the TMJ, and the dentition, our teeth. So the occlusal articulation or interaction between the dentition is very important. And if you're reading these and you just get some familiarity with the nomenclature of the dentition and how they're supposed to articulate with each other, your stock goes way up with those providers who send you these cases. And I read several of these per day, TMJ MR scans, and it's interesting that only one of my junior colleagues will read them as well because everybody's intimidated by it. And there's no reason to be intimidated by reading these scans. Just get familiar with the nomenclature, which is what I did when I started 25 or 27 years ago in my practice, is I met with a surgeon, the oral surgeon, and I looked at